Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral, leading a fleet on an expedition to India, lands on the coast of present-day Brazil on April 22nd. The land is claimed for Portugal under the Treaty of Tordesillas, which had divided newly discovered territories between Spain and Portugal. The indigenous population, primarily the Tupiniquim people, make contact with the Portuguese. The Portuguese initially show little interest in colonization, focusing instead on trade, particularly in Brazil wood, which is valuable for dye production. The Portuguese crown, recognizing the strategic and economic importance of Brazil, sends an expedition led by Martim Afonso de Sousa to establish permanent settlements. He founds the first official Portuguese village, São Vicente, in 1532. This marks the beginning of organized colonization, with a focus on sugarcane cultivation as a primary economic activity. The Portuguese also start building fortifications to defend against foreign incursions and indigenous resistance, laying the foundation for more extensive territorial control. The Portuguese crown implements the Captaincy System in 1534 to manage and develop Brazil more effectively. The territory is divided into hereditary captaincies, each granted to a donatario, a noble or military leader responsible for governing, defending, and economically developing their land. Most captaincies struggle due to indigenous resistance, lack of resources, and poor management, with only São Vicente and Pernambuco achieving significant success through sugarcane production. Over time, the Portuguese crown takes direct control of Brazil to ensure stability and economic growth. The Portuguese crown establishes Salvador as the first capital of Brazil to centralize colonial administration and strengthen territorial control. Tomé de Sousa is appointed as the first governor-general, bringing soldiers, settlers, and Jesuit missionaries to develop the colony. Salvador becomes a major hub for the sugar economy and the transatlantic slave trade, playing a crucial role in Portugal's colonial system. The city's strategic location on the northeastern coast allows for better defense against foreign threats and improved trade connections with Europe and Africa. The Portuguese begin importing enslaved Africans to Brazil in the mid-16th century to meet the growing labor demands of the sugarcane plantations. Initially, indigenous peoples were forced into labor, but resistance, high mortality rates, and agreements with the Catholic Church led to an increased reliance on African slaves. Portuguese traders, operating mainly from West Africa, transport millions of enslaved people to Brazil over the following centuries. African labor becomes the backbone of the colonial economy, particularly in sugar production, mining, and later coffee cultivation, shaping Brazil's demographic and cultural landscape. In 1555, French naval officer Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon leads an expedition to establish a colony called France Antarctique in Guanabara Bay, present-day Rio de Janeiro. The French aim to gain a foothold in the Americas, bypass Portuguese trade monopolies, and spread Protestantism. The settlement attracts Huguenot and Catholic settlers, but internal conflicts weaken the colony. In 1560, the Portuguese, led by Mem de Sa, launch an assault, forcing the French to retreat. A final attack in 1567, aided by indigenous allies, expels the remaining French, securing Portuguese control over the region. Between 1624 and 1654, the Dutch attempt to seize control of Brazil's lucrative sugar-producing regions. The first invasion occurs in 1624, when the Dutch West India Company captures Salvador, but the Portuguese quickly reclaim the city in 1625. A larger invasion follows in 1630, with the Dutch successfully occupying Pernambuco and other parts of the northeast. Under the leadership of Johann Maurits of Nassau, the Dutch establish a well-administered colony, promoting religious tolerance and scientific exploration. However, a series of Portuguese and indigenous resistance movements, culminating in the Battle of Guararapes in 1648-1649, weakened Dutch control. By 1654, the Portuguese forced the Dutch to surrender, restoring full control over Brazil. In the late 17th century, large gold deposits are discovered in Minas Gerais, triggering a massive gold rush that transforms Brazil's economy and society. Thousands of Portuguese settlers, along with enslaved Africans and indigenous laborers, migrate to the region in search of wealth. The influx of people leads to the rapid growth of towns like Vila Rica, now Ouro Preto, and the establishment of new administrative structures to regulate mining and tax revenue for the Portuguese crown. Gold from Brazil becomes a key source of wealth for Portugal, funding its economy and European ambitions. However, by the mid-18th century, gold production declines, leading to economic shifts and increasing colonial unrest. In 1763, the Portuguese crown relocates the capital of Brazil from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro to be closer to the gold-rich interior regions of Minas Gerais. The move reflects the economic shift from sugarcane production in the northeast to gold and diamond mining in the southeast. Rio de Janeiro's strategic coastal location also strengthens Portuguese control over trade routes and defense against foreign threats. The city grows rapidly, becoming the administrative and economic center of the colony, a role it continues to play even after the decline of gold production. In 1789, a group of influential individuals, including miners, intellectuals, and members of the local elite in the region of Minas Gerais, plot to overthrow Portuguese rule and establish an independent Brazilian republic. Known as the Inconfidência Mineira, the rebellion is inspired by Enlightenment ideas and the growing discontent over heavy taxes and economic hardship, particularly the mining taxes imposed by the Portuguese crown. The plot is betrayed, and the leaders, including the prominent figure Tiradentes, are arrested. Tiradentes is eventually executed, and the other conspirators are either exiled or imprisoned. The rebellion, though unsuccessful, becomes an important symbol of the desire for independence in Brazil. In 1808, the Portuguese royal court, led by King João VI, flees to Brazil to escape the Napoleonic invasion of Portugal. Rio de Janeiro becomes the capital of the Portuguese Empire, marking the first time a European monarchy rules from the Americas. This move significantly alters the status of Brazil, as it is no longer just a colony, but a central part of the empire. King João VI introduces various reforms to modernize Brazil, including opening Brazilian ports to international trade, establishing new institutions, and fostering economic growth. His presence in Brazil also strengthens the region's political and economic importance, laying the groundwork for Brazil's eventual independence. In 1815, Brazil is elevated to the status of a kingdom, forming the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. This change reflects the importance of Brazil within the empire after the Portuguese royal family relocated there due to Napoleon's invasions of Europe. The decision is made to recognize Brazil's new role as a political and economic hub, with its capital now being Rio de Janeiro. Brazil, as part of the United Kingdom, enjoys more autonomy and influence, yet it remains under the sovereignty of the Portuguese crown. This move sets the stage for growing calls for Brazilian independence, as the colony increasingly develops its own political and economic identity. On September 7, 1822, Dom Pedro I, the son of King João VI of Portugal, declares Brazil's independence from Portugal. Faced with political tension and the demands of both Brazilian elites and the Portuguese government for greater autonomy, Dom Pedro refuses to return to Portugal when ordered by the Portuguese Cortes. Instead, he proclaims Independencia ou Morte, independence or death, at the banks of the Ipiranga River in São Paulo. This declaration marks the birth of the independent Empire of Brazil, with Dom Pedro I becoming its first emperor. The move follows years of economic and political unrest, including the desire for a more autonomous government and the Portuguese monarchy's weakened influence. In 1824, Brazil's first constitution is adopted, establishing a constitutional monarchy under Emperor Dom Pedro I. The constitution creates a system with a central government divided into executive, legislative, and judicial branches, with the emperor holding significant power, including the right to dissolve the legislature and appoint the prime minister. It grants certain civil liberties, such as freedom of religion and the press, but also maintains slavery and limits political participation to a small, land-owning elite. The constitution is seen as a compromise between maintaining monarchical authority and addressing demands for a more structured government. Despite its progressive features, it faces challenges from both conservative factions and growing republican sentiments. In 1888, Brazil abolishes slavery with the signing of the Lei Áurea, Golden Law, which formally ends the institution after centuries of reliance on enslaved Africans for labor, particularly in the sugar, coffee, and mining industries. The law is signed by Princess Isabel, the daughter of Emperor Dom Pedro II, who is acting as regent in her father's absence. The abolition is the result of growing pressure from abolitionist movements, international condemnation, and economic changes, as slavery becomes increasingly seen as an obstacle to Brazil's modernization. However, the law provides no compensation for former slaves or provisions for their integration into society, leading to continued social and economic challenges. On November 15, 1889, Brazil's monarchy is overthrown in a military coup, and the Republic of Brazil is proclaimed. The coup, led by military officers and supported by civilian republicans, removes Emperor Dom Pedro II from power and ends over 60 years of monarchical rule. The coup is largely bloodless, and the country transitions to a federal republic with a new government led by Marechal Deodoro da Fonseca, who assumes the presidency. The move is driven by dissatisfaction with the monarchy, particularly its failure to address the needs of the military, the growing influence of republican ideas, and social changes following the abolition of slavery. The Republic marks the beginning of Brazil's modern political era. From 1964 to 1985, Brazil is ruled by a military dictatorship following a coup d'état that overthrows the democratically elected government of João Goulart. The military, supported by the United States during the Cold War, justifies the coup as a means to prevent a perceived communist threat, but the dictatorship is characterized by repression, censorship, and the suppression of political opposition. Over the years, the regime becomes increasingly authoritarian, with human rights violations, torture, and imprisonment of political dissidents. Despite economic growth in the 1970s, the military government faces growing unrest, and by the mid-1980s, economic crises and public demand for democracy lead to a gradual transition. In 1985, the dictatorship ends, and Brazil returns to democratic rule with the election of Tancredo Neves as president, though he dies before taking office, and his vice president, José Sarney, assumes the presidency. In 1988, Brazil adopts a new democratic constitution, marking the end of over 2 decades of military rule and authoritarianism. The constitution establishes a federal republic with a presidential system, guarantees civil liberties such as freedom of speech and assembly, and ensures workers' rights, social welfare, and environmental protection. It also creates mechanisms for greater political participation and accountability, such as direct elections for president and legislative representatives. The new constitution is a key milestone in Brazil's democratization, consolidating democratic institutions and making a commitment to human rights and social justice despite ongoing economic challenges and political instability.